On the day my so-called living will was read, my children sat across from me in a polished law office, dressed in quiet confidence, already imagining what they believed was theirs, until they heard that the $400,000 business they had been running was no longer in their names, but had been legally transferred to my assistant the day before. I didn't say a word when the lawyer began. I didn't need to. Because everything that mattered was already written down. Stay with me until the end, and tell me where you're watching from, because moments like this don't come suddenly, they build over years. The office smelled faintly of leather and paper, the kind of place where decisions feel permanent the moment they're spoken. My son sat to my right, leaning back in his chair like he belonged there. My daughter sat across from me, legs crossed neatly, her expression calm but alert, the way people look when they're trying not to seem too eager. They had both arrived early. That told me everything I needed to know. "Are we waiting for anyone else?" my son asked, glancing at his watch. The lawyer shook his head. "No. We can begin whenever you're ready." I noticed the way my daughter's eyes flickered briefly toward me, not with concern, not with warmth, but with calculation. It was subtle. If you didn't know her, you might have missed it. But I didn't miss it. I had stopped missing those things a long time ago. "This won't take long," the lawyer said, opening the folder in front of him. My son leaned forward slightly at that, resting his elbows on his knees. My daughter straightened in her seat. Neither of them looked at me. They didn't need to. In their minds, this wasn't about me. It was about what came after. The business had been the center of everything for years. I built it from the ground up, long nights, early mornings, risks no one else was willing to take. It wasn't glamorous in the beginning. It was work. Real work. The kind that doesn't get noticed until it starts making money. And now, it was worth over $400,000. They had been running it for the past 2 years. At first, I told myself it was time. That stepping back was natural. That this was how things were supposed to go: parents build, children continue. But somewhere along the way, something shifted. Decisions started being made without me. Meetings I used to lead happened without an invitation. And when I asked questions, the answers came shorter. Less detailed. More dismissive. "We've got it handled, Mom." That became their favorite sentence. I let it happen longer than I should have. Not because I didn't notice. But because I wanted to believe it meant something else. The lawyer cleared his throat softly, bringing the room back into focus. Papers shuffled. A pen clicked once. My son exhaled quietly, like he was preparing to hear something he had already accepted as fact. My daughter folded her hands neatly in her lap, her posture composed, almost practiced. I looked at them both for a moment. Not with anger. Not even with disappointment. Just clarity. Because this wasn't the first time I had sat across from them and realized I was no longer part of the equation. It was just the first time. I had decided to do something about it. The lawyer adjusted his glasses and began reading in a calm, measured tone, the kind that doesn't rush and doesn't react, just delivers. My children leaned in slightly, not obviously, but enough for me to notice. They were listening carefully now. Not to me, but to what they believed was coming next. "This document reflects the current structure of Ms. Carter's living will and associated asset allocations," he said, flipping the first page. My son nodded faintly, like everything was proceeding exactly as expected. My daughter remained still, her expression composed, but her fingers tightened slightly against her lap. I watched them both. Not because I needed to understand what they were thinking. But because I already did. For the past 2 years, the lawyer continued, the business known as Carter Logistics has been operated under the management of her children, Daniel Carter and Melissa Carter. At the mention of their names, they both straightened just a little more. Recognition. Ownership. Expectation. That word, ownership, had become very comfortable for them. Too comfortable. With the understanding that they would continue overseeing day-to-day operations, the lawyer added. My son gave a small, almost satisfied nod, like a silent confirmation. My daughter's lips pressed together slightly, but there was a hint of anticipation now. They weren't nervous. They were waiting. Because in their minds, this was the part where everything became official. The part where what they had already assumed would be confirmed. I let my hands rest calmly in my lap, my posture relaxed, my breathing steady. I had sat through enough meetings in my life to recognize this moment, not just in business, but in people. The moment before reality shifts. The business, the lawyer continued, his tone unchanged, has undergone a legal restructuring as of yesterday morning. That was the first pause. A small one. But enough. My son's head tilted slightly. What does that mean? He asked, his voice still calm, but with the first hint of something else underneath. The lawyer didn't answer immediately. He simply turned the page. It means, he said, that the ownership status has been updated. The room felt different now. Not tense yet. But no longer certain. My daughter leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing just enough to signal attention, not panic, not concern, but focus. Updated how? She asked. Her voice was controlled. Polite. But there was something behind it now. Something sharper. I didn't look at either of them. I kept my gaze on the table, on the clean lines of the folder in front of the lawyer, on the quiet order of a process that didn't require emotion to be effective. Because emotion had never been the point. The lawyer folded his hands briefly, then continued. As of yesterday, he said, the full ownership of Carter Logistics has been legally transferred. He stopped just long enough for the words to settle. My son leaned forward now, no longer hiding it. My daughter's posture stiffened, her composure tightening like something inside her had just braced. To Ms. Elaine Foster, the lawyer finished. Silence. Not the kind that lingers gently. The kind that drops. Heavy. My son blinked once, like he hadn't heard correctly. I'm sorry, what? He said. My daughter didn't speak at all. Her eyes moved quickly across the papers in front of the lawyer, searching for something, anything, that would contradict what had just been said. I lifted my gaze then. Slowly. And for the first time since we sat down. I looked directly at them. Because this was the moment they had been waiting for. They just hadn't realized, they weren't the ones it was meant for. My son's voice broke the silence first, but it didn't sound like him. It was thinner, uncertain, like the ground beneath him had shifted and he hadn't caught up yet. Who is Elaine Foster? He asked, even though I knew he already knew the answer. My daughter didn't ask anything. She was already flipping through the pages in front of the lawyer, faster now, her composure cracking just enough to be visible. The calm, controlled expression she had walked in with was gone, replaced by something sharper. Urgency. I let the silence stretch for a moment longer before speaking, not because I wanted to make it dramatic, but because I had learned that silence often says more than explanation ever could. You know who she is, I said quietly. That made my son look at me. Really look at me. And for the first time since we sat down, there was no confidence in his eyes. Just confusion. Mom, that's your assistant, he said, like he was trying to correct a mistake that hadn't happened. I nodded once. Yes, I said. She is. The lawyer didn't interrupt. He didn't need to. Everything that mattered was already written in front of them. My daughter finally stopped turning pages, her hand resting flat against the document like she was trying to hold it still. This doesn't make any sense, she said, her voice tighter now. We've been running that business for 2 years. I looked at her calmly. Yes, I said. You have. And that was the truth. They had been running it. Making decisions. Signing contracts. Speaking on behalf of something they believed already belonged to them. Then how could you just transfer it? She pressed. Without even telling us? I didn't answer right away. Instead, I leaned back slightly in my chair, letting my hands rest in my lap the way I always had in meetings, calm, composed, never rushed. Because ownership and responsibility aren't the same thing, I said. The room went still again. My son frowned, shaking his head slightly. That doesn't explain anything, he said. We've been handling everything. The clients, the operations. I know, I said gently. I've been watching. That stopped him. Not loudly. But completely. My daughter let out a small breath, almost a laugh, but there was no humor in it. Watching, she repeated. You stepped back. You told us to take over. I met her eyes. I told you to run it, I said. I never said it was yours. That was the first moment neither of them had an immediate response. Because that line, small as it was, had always been there. They had just chosen not to see it. My son looked down at the table again, his jaw tightening. We thought, he started, then stopped. I didn't finish the sentence for him. I didn't need to. They thought it was theirs. They thought time and proximity had turned responsibility into entitlement. They thought I would follow the same pattern I always had, step back, say nothing, and let things become whatever they decided. My daughter straightened slightly, her tone shifting again, more defensive now. So you just gave it away, she said. To an employee? I didn't react to the word. I had heard it before. The way people reduce loyalty to a job title when it's convenient. I transferred it, I said. Legally. Thoughtfully. Intentionally. The difference mattered. My son finally looked up again, and this time, there was something new in his expression. Not just confusion. Not just disbelief. Something closer to realization. Because for the first time, he was starting to understand that this wasn't a mistake. It was a decision. My daughter was the first to recover, but not in the way I had hoped. Her expression hardened, her posture straightening like she was rebuilding control piece by piece. Intentional, she repeated. You're saying this was planned? I nodded once. Yes, I said calmly. That answer didn't calm her. It did the opposite. So while we were running the company, making decisions, handling everything, you were just planning to take it away, she said, her voice rising. Slightly now. My son didn't interrupt her this time. He just watched me, quieter than before, like he was waiting for something he hadn't heard yet. I didn't rush to respond. I had learned that rushing often sounded like defending. And I wasn't defending anything. I wasn't taking anything away, I said. I was deciding where it belonged. That landed differently. Not softer, but clearer. My daughter let out a short breath, shaking her head. That's the same thing, she said. We built that business too. We kept it running. I looked at her, not dismissing what she said, but not accepting it as the full truth either. You maintained it, I said. There's a difference. The room went still again. My son leaned forward slightly, his hands clasping together now, not out of confidence, but focus. Then explain it, he said. Because right now, none of this makes sense. I met his eyes, steady and calm. It makes sense, I said. You just weren't part of the decision. That hit harder than anything else so far. My daughter's expression tightened immediately. We should have been, she said. We're your children. There it was. Not concern. Not confusion. Entitlement. I let a small pause settle before responding. Yes, I said. You are. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I just let the words sit there on their own. Because being my children had never been in question. What had changed was everything else. My son looked down again, his jaw tightening slightly, like he was trying to process two things at once, the role he believed he had, and the reality in front of him. Then why her? He asked quietly. Why Elaine? That question mattered more than the others. Not because it challenged me. But because it opened something they had never asked before. I leaned back slightly, letting my voice stay even. Because she never treated it like it was already hers, I said. Silence followed. My daughter blinked once, like she hadn't expected that answer. She's an assistant, she said. That's her job. I shook my head gently. No, I said. That's her title. That distinction hung in the air. For 15 years, I continued, she showed up before anyone else and stayed. After everyone left. She asked questions, not to challenge, but to understand. She didn't make decisions behind my back. She didn't assume control. And when I stepped away, I paused, letting the memory settle. She didn't step over me. The room stayed quiet. My son looked up again, something shifting behind his eyes, not resistance, not anger, something closer to recognition. My daughter crossed her arms again, but it felt different now. Less certain. So loyalty matters more than family? She asked. I met her gaze. No, I said. But respect does. That landed. Because respect had never been something I demanded. It had been something I assumed was there. Until it wasn't. I folded my hands in my lap again, calm, steady. This wasn't about choosing her over you, I added. It was about choosing what the business needed to survive. My son exhaled slowly, like that answer reached somewhere deeper than the others. Because for the first time, this wasn't just about inheritance. It was about worth. My daughter didn't respond right away after that. She just stood there, arms still crossed, but her posture had shifted, less certain, more guarded. My son, on the other hand, leaned back slightly, his eyes no longer fixed on me, but somewhere lower, like he was replaying something in his mind. 15 years, he said quietly. I nodded once. Yes. He let out a slow breath, rubbing his hands together, not nervously, but thoughtfully. I didn't realize she'd been there that long, he added. That's because you never had to, I said. The words weren't harsh. Just honest. Clara, my daughter, exhaled sharply at that, turning slightly away before facing me again. So that's it, she said. You reward someone for doing their job, and punish your own children? I didn't react to the framing. Because that's what people do when something doesn't go their way, they redefine it. This isn't about reward or punishment, I said calmly. It's about trust. That word landed differently. My son looked up again, more alert now. You didn't trust us, he asked. I held his gaze for a moment. I trusted you to run it, I said. I didn't trust you to protect it. Silence. Not loud. But final. Clara shook her head immediately. That doesn't make sense. We did protect it. We grew it. We kept it going. Yes, I said. You focused on growth. I paused. But not on foundation. That slowed her down. You made decisions based on what worked in the moment, I continued. Short-term gains. Quick expansions. Risk without reflection. I looked at her directly. And when I asked about those decisions, I was told not to worry. My son's jaw tightened slightly. We thought we were helping, he said. I know, I replied. And again, that was the truth. You were trying to prove you could handle it, I added. But in doing that, you stopped listening. The room went still again. Clara's arms dropped slightly, just enough to show the shift. Not surrender. But impact. And Elaine, my son asked quietly. I nodded. She asked questions, I said. Not because she doubted herself, but because she respected what was built before her. I paused. She didn't try to prove ownership. She tried to understand responsibility. That difference mattered. Even if they hadn't seen it before. Clara looked down briefly, then back up, her voice lower now. So you're saying we lost it, because we acted like it was already ours? I didn't answer immediately. Because this time, she had said it herself. I just gave a small nod. My son leaned back again, slower this time, his shoulders dropping slightly under the weight of that realization. No one argued. No one raised their voice. Because there wasn't anything left to push against. The decision had already been made. And for the first time, they were starting to understand why. My son didn't speak immediately after that. He just sat there, his hands resting loosely in front of him now, no longer gripping anything, no longer trying to hold control over a situation that had already moved past him. Clara shifted again, but this time it wasn't defensive, it was unsettled. So when did you decide this? She asked, her voice quieter, more careful now. I looked at her for a moment before answering. Not all at once, I said. It wasn't a single moment. That was the truth. Then what was it? My son asked, his voice low. I took a small breath, not out of hesitation, but because the answer wasn't simple. It was a pattern, I said. The word hung there, familiar now. You both started making decisions without asking, I continued. Not just operational ones, that would have been fine. But decisions that changed the direction of the business. I paused. Decisions that affected what it stood for. Clara frowned slightly. That's what growth requires, she said. You can't stay the same forever. I agree, I said. That caught her off guard. But growth without understanding what you're growing from, I added, becomes something else. She didn't respond. My son looked at me again, more focused now. You're talking about the expansion deal, he said. I nodded. That was one of them. You moved forward with it before the numbers were stable, I said. Before the risks were fully assessed. I met his eyes. And when I asked about it, you told me it was already handled. He looked down again. I thought you trusted me, he said quietly. I did, I replied. That didn't change. But trust isn't silence, I added. And it isn't ignoring concern. The room went still again. Clara exhaled slowly, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the table. So one disagreement and you decide we're not capable? She asked. I shook my head gently. It wasn't one, I said. It was how you handled it. That difference mattered. You didn't explain. You didn't involve me. You dismissed it. I paused. And that became the pattern. My son nodded faintly, almost to himself. And Elaine? He asked again, like he needed to understand the contrast more clearly. I gave a small nod. She brought me the same proposal, I said. Before it was finalized. That made him look up. She asked questions, I continued. She asked what I thought. Not because she needed permission, but because she understood what was at stake. Clara's posture shifted again, her shoulders lowering slightly. She respected the process, I said. You bypassed it. Silence followed. Not sharp. Not tense. Just clear. My son leaned back slowly, exhaling like something inside him had finally aligned, even if it wasn't comfortable. So you didn't lose confidence in us overnight, he said. No, I replied. That had taken time. I lost it gradually, I added. The words didn't carry anger. Just truth. Clara didn't argue this time. She didn't push back. Because this wasn't about a single mistake anymore. It was about consistency. And consistency is hard to deny. I looked at both of them, sitting there across from me, and for the first time since we walked into that office, they weren't trying to defend their position. They were trying to understand it. And that was something they hadn't done in a very long time. My son sat with that for a long moment, his gaze lowered, his expression no longer defensive, just quiet. Clara shifted beside him, but this time she didn't interrupt. She didn't redirect. She just listened, and that alone told me something had changed. So when did you actually do it? My son asked finally. The transfer. I didn't rush to answer. Yesterday morning, I said. Clara let out a small breath, almost like she had been expecting a different answer, something further back, something she could argue against. But yesterday, that was too close. Too deliberate. You did it right before this meeting, she said. Yes, I replied. The room went still again. My son looked up at me, his eyes searching this time, not for a flaw, but for a reason. Why wait until now? He asked. I held his gaze. Because I needed to be certain, I said. That answer settled heavier than the others. Certain of what? Clara asked, her voice quieter now, less sharp. I paused for a moment, choosing the words carefully, not to soften them, but to make sure they were clear. That nothing was going to change, I said. Neither of them responded. Because they understood. I didn't make this decision after one conversation, I continued. Or one disagreement. I gave it time. I watched. I waited. I paused. I hoped. That word lingered. My son's expression shifted slightly at that, something almost like regret flickering for a moment before settling into something steadier. I thought maybe you'd come back and ask, I said. Not for permission. Not for control. Just, to include me. Clara looked down at the table, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge again, but she didn't speak. You didn't, I added. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was honest. My son exhaled slowly, leaning forward again, his hands resting loosely now. And Elaine did, he said. I nodded once. Yes. That contrast didn't need explanation anymore. Clara shifted again, but this time there was no resistance in it. Just acceptance, settling in slowly, whether she liked it or not. So you gave her everything, she said, not as an accusation, but as a statement she was trying to understand. I gave her responsibility, I corrected gently. Ownership just follows that. That difference mattered. My son nodded faintly, like something in that answer aligned with what he had already begun to see. And us? He asked quietly. I looked at him, really looked at him, not as someone who had taken something from me, but as someone who had never realized what he was slowly losing. I gave you time, I said. The words were soft. But they carried weight. Time to show me how you would handle it. Time to show me what it meant to you. I paused. And time to show me whether I still had a place in it. He didn't look away this time. Clara didn't speak. Because there was nothing left to argue. The decision hadn't been sudden. It hadn't been emotional. It had been earned. And for the first time since we sat down in that room, they understood that this wasn't something taken from them. It was something they had slowly stepped away from, without ever realizing it. The room didn't feel the same anymore after that. It wasn't just quieter, it was clearer. The kind of clarity that doesn't leave room for denial, only for understanding. My son sat back slowly, his shoulders lowered, his posture no longer trying to hold on to anything. Clara remained still, her gaze fixed on the table, but not on the papers anymore, on something deeper, something she hadn't expected to face. So what happens now? She asked finally, her voice softer than it had been all morning. I didn't answer immediately. Because for the first time, that question wasn't mine to carry. That depends on you, I said. She looked up at that, her expression tightening slightly. Like she was trying to find something in my face, an opening, a direction, something she could still shape. What does that mean? She asked. It means, I said calmly, this conversation doesn't undo what's already been done. The lawyer remained silent, his presence almost invisible now, as if even he understood that this part had nothing to do with legal documents anymore. My son nodded faintly, his eyes still on the table. You're saying we don't get it back, he said. I shook my head once. No, I replied. There was no hesitation. No apology. Just truth. Clara exhaled slowly, leaning back in her chair, her arms no longer crossed, just resting, like the fight had left her. "So that's it," she said. "We just move on." I studied her for a moment. "Not exactly," I said. That caught both of their attention. "You move forward," I continued. "But how you do that is something you decide." My son looked up again, more focused now. "Without the business," he said. "Yes," I answered. That reality settled in fully now. No more assumptions. No more expectations. Just what was left. Clara glanced at him briefly, then back at me. "And her?" she asked. "Elaine?" I gave a small nod. "She'll continue running it," I said. "The way she always has." There was no bitterness in my voice. Because there didn't need to be. My son let out a quiet breath, rubbing his hands together slowly. "I guess we never really saw her that way," he said. "I know," I replied. That had been part of the problem. Clara looked down again, her voice quieter now. "We thought being family meant we were already trusted," she said. I met her eyes. "Trust isn't automatic," I said. "It's built. And it's maintained." The words stayed simple. Because they didn't need anything more. The room fell silent again, but this time it wasn't heavy. It was settled. My son nodded slowly, like something inside him had finally aligned, even if it wasn't comfortable. Clara didn't nod. But she didn't argue either. And that said enough. I looked at both of them, sitting there across from me, and realized something I hadn't fully understood until that moment. This wasn't the end of something. It was the removal of an illusion. And what remained was real. The silence after that didn't feel fragile anymore. It felt settled, like something that had been circling for years had finally found its place. My son leaned forward slightly, his hands resting loosely together, not tense, not defensive, just present. Clara sat back, her posture no longer rigid, her gaze lowered, as if she was still adjusting to the weight of what had just happened. "So there's nothing left for us in it," my son said quietly. It wasn't a question. I looked at him, steady. "Not in the way you expected," I said. That distinction mattered. Clara let out a slow breath, her fingers brushing lightly against the table again. "We built something there," she said, almost to herself. "We were part of it." I nodded once. "You were," I said. I didn't take that away from them. "But being part of something," I continued, "isn't the same as being responsible for it." My son's jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't argue. Not this time. Because now, he understood the difference. Clara looked up again, her expression softer, though still searching. "Do you really think she'll do better than us?" she asked. I didn't hesitate. "Yes," I said. Not because I needed to prove anything. But because I believed it. The room went quiet again, but this time it wasn't heavy, it was reflective. My son nodded slowly, almost imperceptibly, like he was accepting something he couldn't change. "She always asked more questions," he said. "I remember that." I gave a small nod. "She still does." Clara glanced at him, then back at me. "And we didn't," she said. It wasn't defensive anymore. Just honest. "You stopped," I replied. That was the truth. "At first, you did," I added. "You asked. You listened. You wanted to understand." I paused. But over time, that changed. My son looked down again, his hands unclasping, resting flat now against the table. "We thought we already understood," he said. I met his eyes. "That's when people stop learning," I said. The words weren't meant to criticize. They were meant to clarify. Clara exhaled slowly, leaning back further in her chair, her shoulders dropping just enough to show the shift. "So this wasn't just about the business," she said. "No," I replied. "It never had been. It was about how we handled it, my son added quietly. I nodded once. Yes. And now, finally, they were saying it themselves. The lawyer closed the folder in front of him, the soft sound of paper meeting paper marking the end of something official, but not the end of what had just been uncovered. My son sat there for a moment longer, then pushed his chair back slightly, not standing yet, just creating space, physically, the way he was starting to do emotionally. Clara didn't move. Not yet. Because this part didn't require movement. It required acceptance. And that doesn't happen all at once. I looked at both of them, sitting there across from me, and realized something I hadn't fully understood until now. They weren't losing the business today. They were losing the assumption that it had ever been theirs. And once that illusion was gone, there was nothing left to argue about. My son didn't stand right away. He stayed seated for a moment longer, his hands resting flat against the table, his gaze fixed somewhere between the papers and the space they had occupied for the last 2 years. Clara finally pushed her chair back, the soft scrape against the floor breaking the stillness just enough to remind us where we were. This doesn't feel real, she said quietly. I looked at her, not dismissing it. It is, I said. There was no softness in the answer. But there was no cruelty either. Just reality, spoken plainly. My son exhaled slowly, then stood up, adjusting his jacket in a way that felt more like habit than intention. I keep thinking there's something we're missing, he said. Something that would explain this differently. I shook my head gently. There isn't, I replied. That was the part people struggle with the most, the idea that sometimes, things are exactly what they appear to be. No hidden clause. No reversal waiting to happen. Clara picked up her bag, holding it a little tighter than necessary. So you just move forward without us? She asked. I met her eyes. No, I said. I move forward without the version of you that stopped listening. That landed differently. Because it wasn't a rejection. It was a distinction. My son looked at me again, more directly now. Is there any way back? He asked. That question stayed in the air longer than the others. Because it mattered. Yes, I said. Both of them looked up at that. But not to what you expected, I continued. Clara frowned slightly. Then to what? I took a small breath, not to soften the answer, but to make it clear. To something honest, I said. Silence followed. Not heavy. Not sharp. Just, still. You can still be part of my life, I added. But not as people who assume control. Not as people who decide things without me. I paused. And not as people who mistake proximity for ownership. My son nodded slowly, like he understood that difference now. Clara didn't respond right away, but her posture had changed again, less rigid, more reflective. And the business? She asked, quieter now. I shook my head once. That part is settled, I said. No hesitation. No room for reinterpretation. My son ran a hand over his face, then let it fall back to his side. We really thought, he started, then stopped. I didn't finish it for him. Because some realizations need to remain unfinished to fully sink in. Clara adjusted her bag slightly, her voice softer than it had been all morning. We didn't think you'd ever draw a line like this, she said. I gave a small nod. I didn't either, I replied. And that was the truth. For years, I had chosen silence over conflict, patience over boundaries, understanding over clarity. Until that morning. The lawyer closed his folder completely now, the sound final, definitive. The meeting was over. But what it revealed was only just beginning to settle. My son didn't move toward the door right away. He stood there, still facing the table, like leaving would make everything that just happened permanent. Clara had already taken a step back, her hand resting on the strap of her bag, but even she didn't rush out. For the first time since we sat down, neither of them seemed to know what the next step was supposed to be. Mom, my son said, his voice quieter now, stripped of everything it had carried earlier. I looked at him. Really looked at him. Not as the man who had just lost something he thought was his, but as the boy I had once trusted to grow into someone who understood what it meant to carry responsibility without being told. Yes? I said gently. He hesitated. And that hesitation said more than anything he could have put into words. I didn't see it, he admitted finally. Not the way you did. I nodded once. I know, I said. That had never been the question. Clara shifted slightly, her voice softer now, almost careful. We thought you stepping back meant you were done with it, she said. I met her gaze. I stepped back to see how you would step forward, I replied. That distinction stayed in the air. Clear. Unavoidable. My son exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just a little more, like he was letting go of something he hadn't realized he was holding on to. And we didn't, he said. I didn't correct him. I didn't soften it. I just let the truth stand where it was. Clara looked down for a moment, then back up again. So what happens now, between us? She asked. There was no edge in her voice anymore. No resistance. Just uncertainty. I considered that for a second, not because I didn't have an answer, but because this one mattered differently. We start with honesty, I said. My son nodded faintly. And that looks like what? He asked. It looks like you asking instead of assuming, I said. Listening instead of deciding. Being present, even when there's nothing to gain. The words were simple. But they carried weight. Clara didn't argue. She didn't deflect. She just listened. And me? My son asked quietly. I held his gaze. You decide who you want to be without something to inherit, I said. That landed deeper than anything else. Because this was no longer about the business. It was about identity. About character. About what was left when expectation was taken away. My son didn't respond right away. He just nodded once. Slowly. Like something inside him had shifted into place, even if it wasn't comfortable. Clara glanced at him, then back at me, but she didn't speak. Not this time. Because there was nothing left to negotiate. Nothing left to reframe. The truth had already done its work. I looked at both of them. One last time, standing there in that quiet office, and for the first time in a long time. I didn't feel like I needed anything from them. Not understanding. Not agreement. Not even change. Because whatever came next, was no longer something I had to wait for. They left quietly. No raised voices. No final argument. Just the soft sound of the door opening, then closing behind them. My son stepped out first this time, not ahead of Clara, not leading, just walking. She followed a second later, her posture still composed, but without the certainty she had carried into that room. And then it was over. The lawyer gathered his papers without saying much, offering a polite nod before leaving me alone in the office. The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It wasn't tense. It simply settled. I remained seated for a moment, my hands resting in my lap, exactly where they had been when this all began. The same chair. The same room. And yet, everything felt different. Not because something had been taken away. But because something had finally been made clear. I stood slowly, smoothing the front of my jacket out of habit more than necessity, and walked toward the window. Outside, the world moved the same way it always had, cars passing, people walking, life continuing without pause. Nothing had changed out there. But inside, something had. For years, I had told myself that stepping back meant trusting them. That letting go meant giving them space to grow. And for a long time, I believed that was enough. But what I hadn't realized was this: stepping back doesn't mean disappearing. And trust doesn't mean silence. I rested my hand lightly against the glass, looking out at the reflection staring back at me. Older, yes. Wiser, maybe. But clearer than I had been in years. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel regret. And I didn't feel like I had lost anything. Because the truth was, I hadn't taken something away from my children that day. I had simply stopped giving them something they had never learned to value. The business. The control. The assumption that it would always be theirs. And in doing that, I gave something back to myself. Clarity. Not the kind that comes from winning, but the kind that comes from understanding exactly where you stand.